deep in the bowels of the mothership, we have recently uncovered a series of ancient tapes containing conversations on game design which we are declassifying and sharing with the public for the first time. This is the Barash Files. Wee woo, pretty spooky stuff.
Let's do this. Let's have some fun. This is nice. This is good we did this way too, because I got a level set. Every episode will be consistent. It's good. We love that.
Great.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio, The Barash Files. My name is Andy. I'm here as always with my co-host Anthony. Competitive community. Wait, hold on. What's the word? Community. What's our people that make communities?
Community custodian, community creator, community consulter.
Is there not a word for this?
Community
people that create communities.
corporate cool guy.
Like if you're like a figurehead in a community, or like somebody that like you know,
president.
Captain.
Organizer. The word is organizer. All right, take this again.
Anthony Barack Obama, community organizer, Meg.
Let me be clear.
I
We play Cube every
accidentally.
Tuesday.
Oh, laughing hurts.
Anthony, competitive community organizer, Maddox.
That's right. Go down to the state fair, organize a community, get a blue ribbon community, try and beat out all the competition. All those other communities are second to ours.
I need somebody out there to make a supercut of all the times Anthony just says, "That's right," right after I
That's right.
right after I give him his little nickname for the week. This is, as I mentioned, another episode of the Barash Files. So we're, of course, also here with Zach, competitive Magic player, Barash.
Once upon a time, yes.
Yeah, you have a history as a competitive Magic player, which Anthony and I do not have in the slightest.
That changed a little bit. I don't play competitive Magic anymore because,
can't.
spoilers,
You're
I work
barred.
for Wizards of the Coast, so these are my opinions and not my employer's. But happy to talk about my experiences with playing competitive Magic, moving away from competitive Magic, making choices to not pursue professional Magic, or none of that. We can just talk about Cube and competition.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's an interesting perspective. I think very few people listening or in the Magic world more broadly ever get the chance to play at the kind of competitive level you've played at. And so I think some perspective into like what that looks like, what the texture of that competition is like, is interesting perspective. I think you're also coming from an interesting spot in that in addition to having played competitively, you also have spent a lot of time in the Cube world and sort of have seen or understood and been part of organizing and know what it's like to help organize a community. And we've talked a little bit in the past about how those things maybe are kind of at odds sometimes. I mean, specifically, I went through a period, 18 months ago, where I was really interested in just getting better as a Magic player. And I was talking to you, one of the more skilled Magic players that I consider a friend that would be willing to help me out with this. And a lot of things that came up a lot were just like, the way that we play Magic here in Baltimore is kind of not conducive to getting a lot better at Magic. It's instead conducive to having a very open and welcoming Cube night on Tuesdays where anyone can show up and play. And it's kind of hard in that context, maybe in some ways, to actually just get a lot better at the game if that's not your main goal.
Absolutely. The beautiful thing about a welcoming and open environment is it's probably one of the best ways to have a growing environment, to have a stable environment that you're going to fire every week. You're firing multiple pods now. Once you start inadvertently or otherwise sort of creating barriers to entry, which is something that I've experienced multiple times in New York City, where I'm from, oftentimes you just cap the size of your community, and attrition means that over time your community shrinks.
Yeah, and I mean, it's dumb little obvious things, right? Like, I think probably one of the best ways to get better at playing Magic is to play with other really skilled players. And if I cared mostly about getting better, I probably wouldn't just roll down on Tuesdays and play with any old person that showed up every week. I'd probably spend that time intentionally playing with other people that were also invested in getting a lot better at the game and cared about improving their skill in measurable ways.
And the community suffers, even if you were just there in the spiky draft. Both of you are ambassadors for the community, and the work that you're putting in to make it a welcoming, egalitarian space that is trying to be larger and more diverse and more friendly to people takes work. And you sitting aside in a different pod means you're not doing that work.
Yeah, and if I'm focusing completely on just doing as well at this match as I possibly can and not, paying attention to the vibes, making sure not someone a table over isn't being weird and making people uncomfortable or, whatever, These things are just in conflict, or at least hard to do them both at the same time because they're totally different goals.
And I'll also say, fundamentally, both of you are quite strong, quite enfranchised, and experienced Magic players. I have seen both of you play quite a bit. I have seen your results at CubeCon, at Boston Cube Party. You both have gone on some very serious tears against some very skilled players.
We have disproven the null hypothesis that we can never win.
Yes, that's true.
No, but it's very hard to set an accurate benchmark for yourself. It's very hard to set clear, specific, measurable, achievable goals, especially when it comes to a very nebulous concept like self-improvement. And I think a lot of people struggle with competition because they don't know what good enough is.
It's especially hard in Magic, too. Like, Magic being a game of so much variance, and Paul Odomedarosa's like lifetime win percentage on the Pro Tour is like 61% or 59% or something. It's like, in order to be great, like, you're still going to lose a whole bunch, and you got to just play so much, and like, it's a really hard thing to get good at, which I think is a big part of the appeal, I expect, of playing competitively. If it was like an easy road to get good at it, then it wouldn't be as exciting or interesting.
It's also a different path for people. Like, for me, I was pretty obstinate about, I just love limited. The first Grand Prix that I ever day two'd was a constructed Grand Prix, and I did the absolutely normal thing, and I was like, cool, wow, for me, that was a lot easier than day twoing a limited GP. No shade on constructed players. It's just like, I didn't have to wake up at 8 a.m. and build a seal deck and make some of the most important decisions I'd make all day. I rolled up at 9 a.m., and I knew my deck, and I knew most of my opponent's decks, and I knew my sideboarding plan, and I had to think a lot less. I took that success, and then I never played another constructed GP ever again because I love limited that much.
Which explains, of course, your love for Cube.
Absolutely. Cube was one of my first introductions, one of my like big rites of passage into becoming a stronger player within my community. I got back into the game, a little bit of history, in 2010. I got back involved in a store community, or not back involved, store community for the first time around that time. I got into team drafting. The first event that I ever performed well at was a cube tournament, common on common cube, that my friend ran, that I won. And then the next year, I did a competition for hipsters, and my friend won their Taiga back for me.
It was like a Taiga trophy that was passed around?
It was.
That's pretty cool. We do the same thing at our Holiday Chaos Draft, but with a Fallen Empires pack.
Yeah, I've loved Cube ever since. I've been curating my Cube since 2013, I think. And Cube has been a very different kind of space. Part of what I love about it is competitive, but the ceiling of how good I've ever aspired to be is much, much lower. Every Cube tournament that I've been to sort of has these feels of like a PTQ, a Pro Tour qualifier, or a Grand Prix, or an RCQ, but everybody's taking it a lot less seriously. There's no actual pathway to some bigger event that people are shooting for.
Nor is there money on the line, thank God.
And that leads to, I think, in many ways, the exact same experience anyway, because spikes are going to be spikes. And for a lot of other people, it leads to a much more pleasant experience. And one thing that I've been trying to do, especially over the past couple of years, as I've started at Wizards, and even before that I was just curtailing the amount of events that I was going to, is try and be really honest with myself about how much better do I want to be. I enjoy the process of self-improvement, but the more that you improve, the harder fought every lesson is, and the more distributed over time they are. I don't know, my goal now is I want to be a really nice end boss at my local game store. I want to be somebody who is pleasant to play against, is going to respect their opponents, and I want to play seriously against all the people who want to play seriously, and just be like as nice as I can against everybody else. Because, I don't know, we probably most of us have experienced somebody who's not so gracious in that role. And that leads to these exclusionary communities, which ultimately just shrink the population overall.
I think it's really interesting how nuanced and complex of a social interaction playing a game of Magic is. Like, take the whole game away completely. Just the idea that you're sitting down with, and sometimes a total stranger, or at least somebody for whom you know nothing about other than they play Magic, right? That's the one thing you have in common with them. And then you're doing a competitive thing that is zero-sum. One of you will win, one of you will lose. People want to win. They don't want to be the loser. And I think just all of the little things you do, how you talk to your opponent in between games, how you present your deck to be cut, how you respond when they take an action. Yeah, all these little things. It's actually a really nuanced social interaction in order to make that be comfortable. And it's something I feel like is a skill I've worked on really hard as well, specifically for our Cube Night, just to like make sure that if someone there is new, I am especially conscious of just like being as gracious as I possibly can be about every like interaction, about making small talk between the games. But it's a weird thing. It's a people don't talk about it, but it's a really complex social interaction to have with a stranger.
Absolutely. Especially when I'm playing against somebody for the first time, I'm really trying to key in to what are they bringing to this experience? What are they comfortable with? What's going to make them feel comfortable? Some people, I really want to make sure, like, I don't want to make you feel bad. I'm going to make sure that every trigger is remembered. Everything that's going to go badly for me, I want to make sure that those things happen so you don't feel like I'm taking advantage of you. And there are some people who feel like that's going to be patronizing. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that sort of thing. Some people like to relax and joke around or even trash talk. And I can ease my way into doing that, especially if I know somebody. I don't know. At this point, a lot of that has become completely unconscious. I'm just trying to match the energy that somebody's bringing or provide a complimentary one so that both of us can have a good time. And I don't know, maybe that's part of the reason that I've never pursued competition full time as a dedicated player. Of like, at the end of the day, I don't know, I want us both to walk away from every single game that we're playing feeling like we each had a positive experience. Only one person gets to win in a 1v1 game of Magic, barring the like very rare draws. But ideally, both of us get to have fun moments or fun experiences or moments of growth or moments of human connection.
I mean, I think that just goes such a long way. And I think we've all probably been in situations where we've had opponents that are not so gracious. I mean, it's weird how like some things kind of stick with you. And I remember going to the first time I was like playing Magic outside of our friend group, I went to an SCG con and just did a bunch of side event drafts because I kind of like made a goal for myself. I was like, I would like to make this a thing I improve at and go learn and play with, real people.
You
and
also love Limited.
It was such a different environment, and I remember one opponent in particular that just did not say a single word the entire match. Like, they pointed at cards, they updated their life total, but said not a word, and I'm just like, it was a decision point to me at that point. It's like, do I want to actually pursue this? Like, is this is it worth it to have these experiences, to have maybe the satisfying experience to improve as a player? And I didn't go back to a lot of those events, even though, I had a lot more success at our LGS, sort of finding a community of people that had both more similar goals in terms of self-improvement, but more similar goals in terms of trying to have a fun draft night.
And, maybe that person was profoundly uncomfortable. Like, for all you know, it wasn't necessarily they were just, like, not wanting to engage with you or whatever. Maybe they just didn't know how, right? Like, it could be all kinds of things. It just speaks to the fraughtness of that social interaction,
Absolutely.
I think. Something I am really proud of, I think, is the vibes of our playgroup here in Baltimore. And having traveled around a little bit and been in other also, vibrant Cube playgroups, I'm always like, the vibes aren't really quite as good here. And it's
wow.
I'm sorry, I'm just being
flex.
honest, just being honest. And I think something you said was like you try and match the energy of the person that sits down across from you. I think I used to have that attitude of like, all right, if you present your deck for a cut, I'll present mine for a cut. If you don't, I won't. Like, I was just kind of like going with the vibes and letting people kind of direct with the kind of game they wanted to have. I think more and more I've started to realize that, like, no, I should kind of set the tone more as the person that is like part of this group and like, is there every single week and has been there every single week for 2.5 years or whatever, and actually kind of insist on certain things that maybe somebody isn't going to always insist on. I mean, the cutting a deck thing is a dumb example, but you may have heard on the podcast a month or so ago, we had a weird little thing come up where the rare, like, minor conflict at a Cube Night, like, somebody like DM'd me afterwards and was just like, hey, I felt weird because my opponent in one round, like, didn't present their deck for a cut. They had a couple, like, really lucky top decks in a row. I don't think they were cheating, but also it feels bad to not have the deck presented for a cut. And just, like, I want you to know I feel bad about it. And I kind of had the realization of, like, I think for a long time, in an attempt to, like, emphasize casualness, I think cutting became a thing that we didn't really do. Like, I think you for a long time would just refuse to cut or not present unless somebody asked you to.
Oh, I always present, and I still never cut.
And I kind of realized, like, oh, that's a thing that sounds like it would be good to sort of express the casualness and the lack of spikiness, but it also does a little bit undermine the idea that, like, we're playing a game that, people might care about, whether there's stakes or not, right? And so, like, this person that felt uncomfortable because they felt like the culture was nobody cuts, therefore they couldn't even ask their opponent to cut their deck. That's a problem in the kind of the opposite way that I would have expected. And so I am much more conscious now about like always presenting and asking for a cut in the friendliest possible way. I'm not going to pick up my opponent's deck and shuffle it. Not that that's unfriendly, but it's just like a step too far. It's like, I don't need to do that. Like, I know you're not cheating. This is a like little thing we do, a little ritual just to like acknowledge that we're in this space where this matters to some degree, to some people.
I mean, I think a little bit of structure and formality does go a long way just to setting expectations about, I know what's going to happen when I sit down at this table, and that can make people a lot more comfortable. I mean, if we zoom out even bigger, we're looking at a bunch of adults sitting down doing a structured activity in order to facilitate having a community experience, and that structure, like that playing the game is that structure. And if the expectations about the way that game differ, that's just going to make it a lot more difficult.
Yeah. Culture and ritual go hand in hand with each other. I guess to follow up on what I said, I do actually, I think, impose a lot of things, not forcefully on my opponent, but like I just always present. I'm always happy to cut. And the way that I internalize it and phrase it is like, no, we're helping each other get that last bit of shuffling in and of our deck. Mm-hmm. If anything, I ran into the opposite issue of it a couple nights ago when we cube drafted. I just kept presenting to Patrick, and Patrick was like, I am not going to cut your deck. Yeah. And I was like, I'm literally not even thinking about it. It's pure muscle memory.
I mean, that's muscle memory from being a competitive player. Like, that's the thing you must do at so many levels. And so, that might just be ingrained in you at this point.
Yeah, but I like to formalize a lot of these accurate processes in a way that is not going to be like, I'm doing this because I don't trust you. It's just like, no, I'm doing this because we're collaborating on shuffling each other's decks. And we're probably going to shuffle each other's decks in different ways, which ideally is going to lead to a better shuffled experience.
You can't get Anthony started on the ways to shuffle cards. It's a whole thing, a whole rabbit hole.
I've dusted off my article. I'm working on it over here.
I mean, another good example, which is the thing I think is kind of fraught, is I've seen you sometimes play against somebody and you, Zach, I should just being specific because people can't hear what I'm pointing to. I've seen you, Zach, play with people and sometimes like play your cards upside down, which is a very generous thing to do. Yeah. Like, and I think you've only done this when somebody has maybe read a couple cards in the first place or whatever. But it's the thing. It's like, I know what this card does. Here's a chance for you to read it without having to ask me to turn it around. At the same time, some people, like you mentioned, do find that sort of thing patronizing. They're like, I know what I have been in that seat and been like, I know what the card does. Stop playing it upside down. Like, I know what the cards do. If I don't, I'll ask you. But at the same time, not everyone's going to feel comfortable asking someone to read a card. They're going to feel like I'm supposed to know what that does, and so I'm just going to not read it. And this actually came up with Sal and I at the Chaos Draft, where it was Chaos Draft. I didn't know most of the cards. Well, I did know most of them probably, but I didn't know the specific text of all of them in detail. And Sal played a card and like said what it did. Just like, oh, it's an activated ability. I can sacrifice a creature to give it, a +1/+1 counter. And I was like, cool. And then we played a whole game, and then at the end, I read the card, and it was activate only as a sorcery, and I was like, that definitely mattered. Like, I for sure didn't like. I didn't know if it was activate only as a sorcery, and I played around it the entire game and lost, probably partially because I was expecting this to be a thing that would be activated at instant speed. And Sal, of course, wasn't trying to trick me, but was just trying to be like, oh yeah, it's one of those sacrifice +1/+1 counter, like summarizing it. And I just didn't bother reading the card because I was like, sure, I get it. Like, I'll play. So it's like reading the card is important even for people that are very enfranchised, but it's hard to, you have to like, it requires a like social intelligence to like read the interaction in the person in the space to figure out if they're going to feel patronized by playing a card upside down or by you offering to let them read it or whatever, or if not. And that's a hard thing to do.
And one thing I want to stress is that even if you go into the very competitive world, this doesn't go away. There are going to be people who are like, I know what all the cards do, or like, don't do that. And then there are going to be people who are like reading pretty simple cards. I feel like one of the big level up experiences that I had was at a Grand Prix Montreal in 2016, where I had the good fortune to play against one of the best limited players in the world. And I got absolutely demolished, but I had an education the entire time. I had prided myself on like, I'm a pretty fast player, and I had focused so much on that I'd sort of lost out on the fact that if you just spend like 5 to 10 seconds strategizing every single turn, when you get to the hard turns, you still only need to spend 10 to 15 seconds strategizing instead of going 2 minutes into the tank. And you're not panicking or sort of processing too much information at once. And I played against this person who just like on easy turns took that time, 5 to 10 seconds, I've played against some of the best people in the world who have taken a point of reading cards, which has made me feel less self-conscious about reading cards, even cards that I know, just to make sure I remember everything, that I remember that 6th line of text as accurately as I possibly can. And the answer is, like, for most people, there is no shame in that. And I feel like the shame that exists can be at the least and most competitive levels equally.
I mean, it's a trope in the Magic world, but I think it's true. The saltiest players are always usually at the more competitive end of the least competitive spaces. Like, you're most likely to find somebody salting off if they're just the end boss of their LGS than if they're playing day 2 at a GP, because, I mean, honestly, that kind of temper and, like, you know, emotional response is kind of incompatible with also playing really well for an extended period of time. So that person's likely to not do well at a GP if they're going to be that emotional around missing their 3rd land drop or whatever at the sort of local level. But yeah, I think, to your point, like, I know there are things that I could do to be a much better Magic player that I just can't bring myself to do. And one of them is just read the cards in my hand every turn. Just read them. Actually read all the words. Not get 3 words in and go, I know how this sentence ends, and then don't finish reading it. Just actually read all the cards. And I just don't have the patience to do it.
Well,
Yeah.
Fundamentally, it's a question of, do you want to have that patience? Will you feel happier? Will you enjoy games more if you have that patience? And if the answer is no, great. Like, you know, in this regard, where you want to be. I think more people would be a lot happier if we invested a bit more time in self-knowledge and self-understanding of, like, how good do we want to be? I've looked at my friends who played on the Pro Tour. I've looked at my friends who have chased that dream or gone to PTQs every Saturday and Sunday as much as they possibly could. And I was like, that's not what I want, and I'm glad that they want that. And I've seen people who chase that who didn't, I think, end up really wanting that, but they were doing what felt like was a natural progression.
Or I think maybe more so is acknowledging that, I mean, everybody probably wants to be as good as they can be, but acknowledging the costs to that, like what that's going to take. And if that's going to take a degree of focus and drawing games out because you're going to read your cards in your hand every single turn and you're going to take 5 to 10 more seconds at every decision, even the obvious ones, because that's the correct thing to do to, like, make sure you're being comprehensive. If that's going to mean grinding a bunch of drafts digitally or traveling around to go to a bunch of events, like, you may want to be really good, but you have to accept that there are limitations to how good you can be for the type of Magic you want to play and where you want to play it.
And for me, I know the area of growth that I have right now. I'm enjoying growing as a cube designer and as a game designer. I love getting to travel to cube events, talk to cube designers, be inspired by projects, which is something that we've talked about on previous episodes. That's where I'm focusing my energy, and that's what's bringing me joy right now. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe I'm off Cube in 3 months. Actually, we know I'm going to be. We know I'm going to be off Cube in 3 months. Going to be a first-time father, which I'm very excited about, and is going to knock me out for some period of time.
That's how it do.
I think this idea of reading cards and helping your opponent read cards is a really interesting sort of case study in those kind of social expectations, because I think it really does cut both ways, where you want to be helpful and make information accessible, but the flip side is it can feel patronizing and like you're talking down to somebody, and that really can feel awful. And I'm trying to think about what are the other ways that you can mitigate that, and I wonder if part of it is, like, I know I as a player often also need to read cards, and so if I'm saying, if I see somebody pick up a few cards and have to read them, I will then definitely offer to put a card facing towards my opponent if they need, but then I'm also very likely to ask to read their card. And I think that sort of normalization of the fact that, yeah, we don't have all these cards memorized goes a long way.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that is I know some people have talked about playing fast as a means to, like, put their opponent under pressure.
For sure.
Not that they're literally under any pressure mechanically. Like, your opponent can play as fast as they want, and you can take as much time as you want,
But
as long as you're not...
It sets the tempo.
It
people
sets
will...
the tempo, and you feel like I'm dragging my feet even though you're taking the same length turn you took in the previous match, but now your opponent is, like, tapping their fingers on the table and staring at you, and that's a strategy some people do employ. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, obviously it goes the other way.
And then another thing related to, I mean, you were talking about a thing that your opponent just misread the card and you trusted them because you know them very well and you trust that they're not a cheater. I'm horrified of that kind of thing happening. So I will very often, and my opponent will ask me what a card does, I will summarize it or read it, but then I will offer it to them and say, but please double check me because, this is a chaos draft. I've never seen this card before.
So you don't have a time twister situation with that?
So we don't have a time twister situation because, that is the worst feeling to me to have in a game of Magic is like, oh, I won because I misunderstood a card and I didn't resolve this trigger right, or I missed a negative trigger.
Yeah, the worst.
So yeah, does that feel like a reasonable thing to do? Is just like asking your opponent just to double check things for you?
I did just tell you the story on the way over of there was an event I was at where I had food poisoning and was on 2 hours of sleep and I couldn't do math. I was like, I have 60% of my brain. I
can't believe you tried to play Magic under those circumstances.
Yeah, I think this was...
I'm going to bed under those circumstances, no matter what the stakes are.
I think this was GP Orlando 2017, something like that. 2015, 2016. Anyway, I had food poisoning after making day 2. I slept 2 hours. I ate Pepto-Bismol, bananas, and coffee. And then I was like, 60% of my brain is working. The other 40% isn't working. I can either strategize, I can sequence and play my cards, or I can do math, but I can only do 2 of the 3. Mm-hmm. And I made the decision, I just can't do math today. And I probably was this...
You seem to have a lot of faculty over your brain and the parts of it you were able to turn on and off.
You could just choose not to count. Just like attacking with 3 creatures. I don't know how much that is.
I don't know.
Judge is 4 or 5 bigger. I need help, Judge.
I legit could not count that day. But I don't know, sometimes you just make mistakes and you have to accept it. I think one of my big lessons from that experience was just mistakes happen. Sometimes they are inevitable. There's nothing you can do to stop them from happening. But as long as you don't let them control you or set you on tilt, you're both going to be a stronger player overall because you're not going to let mistakes build on top of each other. And even in that case, I acknowledge I was probably really annoying to play against. You're going to be a more pleasant player overall because going on tilt isn't fun for anybody.
That's got to be one of the most uncomfortable things that can happen in the complex social situation of playing a game with a stranger. Is I don't know how to respond when somebody's tilting off and getting super mad. Other than to be yeah, that's a bummer. You're putting your opponent in the most awkward spot if you are getting super salty around either a mistake you made or bad breaks. It's what are they supposed to say?
If I can't sort of smooth things over or calm things down, I'm just going to focus on let's get through this game as quickly as we can. Because what my opponent probably needs is some combination of a walk outside or to vent to somebody. Mm-hmm. And venting to your opponent is never going to be good for anybody. Mm-hmm. We're meandering a lot in this episode.
Welcome to podcasting, Zach.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you guys think about this. It seems like we sort of have this tension between two things, the sort of drive for competition and self-improvement and the drive for community, and they seem to be pulling in different directions. But I feel like at the same time, they often do sort of synergize because when everyone is on the same page about the competition, it sets really clear expectations. And so I often feel like in a game of Magic, if I'm attacking my 2/2 into their 3/3, it's...
Why would you do that?
Let me
combat trick?
Rethink that.
Or
if I'm in a game of Magic and my opponent is just kind of goofing off and not being serious about the game, in one way it's okay, if I'm trying to win, maybe that gives me an advantage, so that's positive. But we're not on the same page. We're not sharing expectations that we are both trying to win the game in the same way. And so just being clear about why we're there makes things a lot smoother. And I think a lot about why Commander is challenging is so often it feels like in a multiplayer environment, it's hard for everybody to be on the same page. And so a player might just not make a obvious, totally free, safe attack because it's weird in multiplayer and they don't want to create a grudge. But for me, it's so much easier when it's yeah, you make that clear attack. I'm not going to feel mad about it because we are clear on the expectation that we're all trying to win.
Yeah, we ideally in a 1v1 game, everybody is there to be fun is not zero sum, but who ends this game with a game win? Only one of us gets to do that.
Right.
And I like playing against good opponents. I don't want my opponent to punt things away so that I might win. I want the deck I drafted to be tested and my sequencing to be tested by an opponent that is skilled. So it's I want you to do well. I'm not hoping you make a mistake.
Yeah, you even talked about this, Zach, in a couple drafts where we were talking about how it is always a little bit more fun when you win, but then sometimes for you it's not an interesting story. It's I drafted a deck in the irregular cube that was just steamrolled over everybody so cleanly that it just wasn't interesting to talk about or maybe even to play some of those games.
And this gets back to self-knowledge. I know myself. I love the feeling of starting the game as an underdog, which is part of what leads me to be predisposed to playing control decks.
Hey, big same. I also like being an underdog.
I'm just like, it's not the game starts at parity. It's I'm losing. What can I do to turn things around? And then as soon as I've turned the corner of like, oh, I'm winning, how can I just make this game go as quickly as possible so I'm not inducing misery on my opponents? Because the joy for me is in turning things around. It's not domination. It's not winning the game in that regard.
I feel like when I'm behind, I have so much more clarity in what my lines need to be. Like, it's easier for me to figure out what I'm supposed to do when I'm behind than when I'm ahead or at parity. I'm like, well, I curve out. I don't know.
I think we make some of our best decisions, especially when we're thinking competitively when we're behind, because then we make the calculus of, okay, only these cards being on top of my deck matter. So I just need to act as though that is going to be the case.
Right. Yeah. It lets you ignore things where it's like, I can't beat this anyway, therefore I can't play around it, which I think players in a like advantage position will sometimes play around too much stuff because they're just like, well, I'm advantaged, so I got to not lose my advantage no matter what, and will like overthink things. Whereas you can't afford to overthink things when you're behind. You're like, well, either I have the removal spell on the top two cards or I don't, and if I don't, I'm going to lose. So let's play like I do.
Absolutely. And like for me, that's a lot of the fun of the game of I am behind. How can I get myself out of this pickle? I am crushing. I've Ragavan on 1 and Lele on 2 and Brazen Bombardiers on 3. Winning is fun, but I didn't walk away from that game with a story. I just told you the story of 3 powerful cards that are all really, really good cards, but there was not a unique textural experience of that environment that I get to talk about. And like, yeah, I had fun playing the regular cube at Cube for a Cause, and it was a great instance of like, oh, this is a cube that feels more like Booster Draft than a lot of other cubes. I think more cubes should do that because Cube is wonderful and Booster Draft is wonderful and they're directly related to each other, but not that many people are playing in that kind of space. But my biggest stories are things like my 100 Ornithopters draft at Cube for a Cause, where I had this deck that just like had to do all of this weird stuff.
You were doing a lot of stuff. You were taking a lot of game actions.
To steal a game out of nowhere. And it was really challenging to do that kind of sequencing because I'm not like the best at that. And especially it's weird where it's like, okay, I have 6 Ornithopters and I have Jeskai Ascendancy and I have Showdown of the Skulls, which is more than enough to win the game. But there's a lot of triggers that I need to remember. Or playing the finals of that event with Scott's Mertz Cube, where I'm just like, I'm playing the exact kind of deck that I like. I am mostly playing against these kinds of mid-rangey control decks that are my favorite to play against because they have these like fighting game-esque footsies where you're sort of gently testing and probing, and blinking first often makes you lose, but if you blink at the right time, you actually win the game. You had the pleasure of seeing me, like, that was me having some of my most fun in a competitive sense. Mm-hmm. Outside of the experience of like, oh, I'm playing against some of the best people in the world. They're better than me, but I can at least see, can we have a good game? Can I take a game off of them? Can I get a match off of them? This is potential topic change. But Anthony, a couple of minutes ago, you talked about sort of forming a community and getting everybody on board. One of the best experiences that I had in Magic community, especially when I was coming back to the game as an adult, was being part of a nascent competitive community. I was one of the founding members of New York City's Team Draft League. I was one of the commissioners. And that was a bunch of people at my local game store who just, all of us agreed we wanted to get better at the game. We wanted to challenge each other, and we didn't want to be jerks about it. And that was, I would say, not a casual experience at all. It was very competitive. It got more competitive over time. We ended up working with some like very experienced players who sought out information from us for Limited, and that was really fun. And I think even then I had the benefit of like, I know what I'm good at, and that's what I want to deploy. I've always been good at figuring out limited environments quickly. All of my best limited GP results are from release weekend or the following one before everybody had a time to learn the format. I wrote limited guides for hipsters. All of that was, I don't know, joyful competition for me, the kind of community that I self-selected into. And there's also the reminder inherent to that of the sun's going to set on every community at some point, but especially one that is competitive and inherently exclusionary. You have all these people that are raising each other up. It gets a lot harder for somebody to jump on after the fact. We ran into this issue at our local game store where we had a lot of nice competitive people, but also a lot of people would show up, go 0-3, just get absolutely destroyed, and never come back. I can think of 2 people who stayed at that store, and like when they went 1-2 for the first time, that was a big deal for them. But like they were essentially playing the Dark Souls version of hanging out at their local game store, of just like beaten down and beaten down and beaten down. And then by the time they 3-0'd, they're like, cool, I'm ready for a Grand Prix. And day 1 of a Grand Prix was easier for them than just drafting a bunch at our store. That was both joyous, but also it was ultimately self-defeating. You need that to get bigger and bigger and ultimately leave, and it becomes inaccessible to so many people.
Interesting. I mean, do you have any theories about ways to mitigate that in a community? Because I do think part of what you're saying here is that a community is very effective when everybody is on the same page, if not in terms of skill level, but in terms of being motivated by self-improvement. Sort of everybody can agree and a lot of toxic behavior will not emerge. Whereas if people's motivation is, I just want to win, a lot of angle shooting and, you know, this kind of like you're describing, Andy, of people just like playing quickly to try and put their opponents off balance. I think a lot of those kinds of behaviors are motivated by just that pure, I want to trophy this and I don't care about making it a valid win that is meaningful to me because it reflects my self-improvement.
I mean, you're touching on one of the core things of if you can build a culture where everybody recognizes and remembers, at the end of the day, there's a person sitting across the table from me. And both of us have a responsibility to each other to, at the very least, not be a jerk. Ideally identify that the other person deserves fun. I feel like I'm going through a bunch of lessons, but like one of my big lessons from, I think one of the first limited Grand Prix I ever went to is I'm not the hero. I'm not the protagonist. Everybody is the protagonist
You're
of their
the
own
villain.
story.
Now we know.
But like, it's very easy if you just get into that mentality to have this zero-sum fun where my winning is the only thing that matters. The experience of the opponent does not matter when, in fact, oftentimes being a jerk will actually hurt you, both in terms of making it harder to be part of any community whatsoever, or the reputation that you build, or just the fact that you're going to make mistakes because you're so disengaged from what they are doing. So the recognition that I'm the main character in my own story, but every single game that I'm a part of has me sharing the story with somebody else. I try to use that to keep me humble. That like when I win, when I steal a win, especially of just like my opponent doesn't get to play Magic, I'm not going to take joy in that. Like that winning in and of itself isn't fun for me. And I think for a lot of people who are going to share bad beat stories of like, oh man, I just like mulliganed to 4 and I didn't get to do anything. The flip side version of that is the exact same story that that person might be crowing about of like, yeah, I just like played 1 into 2 into 3 and I crushed. And they're not acknowledging the fact that their opponent was completely disengaged from the game. Part of being part of any healthy community is recognizing that those two things are inextricably linked. And I don't know, like if you're going to complain about your bad beats, it's weird to then complain about your successes that are somebody else's bad beat story.
And it's so hard to notice when your opponent is having that bad beat moment. Like it's so easy to be like, oh, I'm kind of curving out, I'm doing okay, and then realize, oh wait, my opponent's only had 3 lands this whole time, and it both like makes you a better player just to notice that, but also then to acknowledge like, yeah, I'm winning this game because you're stuck on resources, and that's just kind of how it goes sometimes.
Yeah, the way that I like to make myself or my friends feel better when mulliganing to Oblivion is the recognition that's the closest I'm ever going to come to playing a completely perfect game of Magic. The mull of like no lander 7, no lander 6, no lander 5, keep my 4, miss my second land drop. Every decision I made was probably the correct one. And in no other game of Magic am I ever going to do that. So at least I get to feel proud about that, even though I lost.
That's one situation where I don't ever remember getting salty in that exact spot because I'm like, all right, well, I'm never expected to win now. Like, all expectation that I win goes out the window. And so I'm always just a little excited, actually. Like, is there any chance I can win on a mull to 4?
It's kind of like easy mode now. It's like, I don't have to win this. But
I'm not going to win, but if I could find a way to win, that would be so cool and fun. And, like, you know, play the game out. And 99% of the time you don't win, you're like, yeah, that was the expected outcome. I did win once on a mull to 4. I remember it very vividly, and it was awesome. And I was like, this rules. My opponent was very unhappy at how happy I was. That was probably should have not been so happy, but I was just very excited.
Yeah. I think mulligans are actually another interesting spot, just going back to everybody being on the same page and having clear expectations. Sometimes somebody will come into a play group and be like, oh, I get a free mulligan, right? Or like, I went to 5. Do you mind if I just take another 5? Because 4 is too far. And it's like, I want to be friendly, but also I think everything is a lot easier when people are on the same page about what are the rules of engagement.
And that's essential to culture as well, and ritual and rules, of the fact that everybody has the same rule set to abide to, especially in 1v1. It is going to smooth out bits of discord.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's difficult to be gracious about, you mulled 5. I recognize that I'm advantaged in this and still wish you the best luck.
I had a thing with our buddy Aaron, who used to be a member of our playgroup and then moved to Richmond.
And then
he's still a member of our playgroup.
He dumped us.
Yeah, he dumped us for a different city. But Aaron and I had a long conversation once about both wanting to get better at the game and improve, and also what the vibes were going to be when we played each other. And we agreed that we would have a little system where, like, every time we sat down, we'd say, you want to play for growth? You want to play for glory? And if we were playing for glory, it was like, we are not going to let anybody take anything back. We've agreed that, like, we should be on our best behavior and, like, be very careful about decisions. And if we're playing for growth, then it's like, oh, you made a decision and then no other game information has changed, but you've changed your mind about the decision. Like, yeah, roll back. Let's, like, roll back and see what happens then. I'm curious what your thoughts are on takebacks in a couple of contexts. One, I think I know the answer to, but, like, if you're playing in a very casual situation, you're trying to build community, like, how do you approach people wanting to take something back?
Always. Every single time. I'll even be like...
Really, always? Even if it's, like, 3 turns ago and, like, it's going to take a lot of work to rebuild the game state and a lot of information has now come to light, they're going to have to pretend you don't know.
That's a little bit different.
So not always.
Yeah, but, well, it's sort of... If a judge would find it impossible to repair the game state at that point, I'm not a judge. I can't do that. Like, I'm not that powerful.
Because my general rule of thumb is I will always allow a take back as long as nothing materially has changed because of the decision you made.
Or no new information has been revealed, I think is key. So if you've already drawn a card off an effect, that's a little more difficult to say that you're just acting in good faith and changed your mind about something.
Right. And again, not that you don't trust people, but just like, we got to have a line somewhere. Otherwise, like, what are we doing here? I mean, an example, in the finals of the Bud Magic Cube draft on Tuesday, I had Inquisition of Cause like my opponent. I knew their entire hand. I then played a creature, and they thought out loud. They were like, do I play around you having Force of Negation in your deck? And we were sitting on my turn instead. They just snuffed out in hand, so it didn't matter if they were tapped out or not. And they were like, no, I don't think I do it now. I want to play around the Force of Negation. And they untapped and did it. I'm trying to remember the exact thing that happened. They thought about doing it on my end step. They untapped and drew the first unknown card in their hand. And then they were like, I really should have done that on your end step. Do you mind if I go back and do that? And I was like, if you want to, that's fine. Like, you drew a card, but I know your entire hand other than that card. I know you could have curved out this turn. Like, I already knew you had a 3-drop and your third land, so, like, your play probably wasn't materially changed. And here's an example where I think takebacks get kind of weird, because they're asking me if they can take something back. I had days in hand, and they were tapped out. So if I let them take it back, I'm massively advantaged, because I'm going to daze that play. So it's like, I told them, like, yeah, you can take it back if you want, and then I dazed it, and they were like, oh, yeah, fine. I played around the Force of Negation, I didn't play around the daze or whatever sequence it was. I can't remember the exact details, but it's a weird thing not to have rules around it, because then the idea of whether you let someone take something back or not can reveal game information and, like, reveal information about your hand.
In general, if I can let somebody, if it's easy for somebody to take something back, I do it. It doesn't matter if it's a casual draft. It doesn't matter if it's a team draft. It doesn't matter if it's CubeCon. Like, we're fallible human beings. Every now and then we're going to make mistakes. I know I get tired at Cube Night sometimes, and I make mistakes, and I don't expect my opponent to let me fix sloppy sequencing that I didn't mean to do, and I don't expect or demand takebacks from people. But yeah, in general, if I can, I will give somebody the take back. It doesn't matter where.
So how about in, like, these competitive contexts where you're playing in the team draft league, and I imagine that sort of type of play, once, like, anything has changed, no one's even expecting takebacks. But do you think it could be a thing that is helpful for growth to, like, is it a thing you would do to get better at the game, allow takebacks or ask for takebacks? Or do you think that if you're trying to get better, you should hold yourself to a competitive standard in every draft you're playing?
I think there are two very different schools of that. There are some kinds of people who want to make the mistake, want to feel the sting of the mistake, and that little bit of scar tissue, it's what's going to stick with them and make them not make that mistake in the future. And there's the type of people who will say, no, let me feel what it is like to have made the correct decision, and that's going to be the thing that sticks with me. Mm-hmm. I think it really just depends on who you are. Who
are you?
I don't find the sting of the defeat to really be that helpful. Mm-hmm. So you might be like, oh, well, you like to take advantage of the situation when it presents itself. I'm like, yeah, but also I'm so far away from really minding that. When we were really grinding hard, yeah, by and large, we didn't do takebacks, with the big exception of when we were testing pre-release or release weekend.
Sure.
Where it's just like, we need to learn all of these cards as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, so we're going to play fit fast, and if we decide that that was the incorrect play and we want to like make the correct play to like test the situation more reasonably, we'll just go and do that.
Yeah.
Here's another situation where I think this gets sticky. So, and I think highlights the weirdness of playing at a casual, ambiguous rules enforcement level or whatever, where you're just like, we're here to have fun. What exactly does that mean to every person? I've had games where I have made a mistake in like the pivotal moment and then like lost immediately because of it and been like, I totally punted that away. I just didn't see this. I totally messed up. Like, it's not even that the thing you just did, like, it was on board. Like, I made an obvious mistake with the information that I had, not with the information that came to light. And I'll sometimes say to my opponent, this has happened a couple times in like the 5 years I've been playing Magic seriously. I'll be like, you win. Now can we actually roll that back and play this game out as if I didn't make that mistake? And it's funny because people, I think, oftentimes go through this sort of like thing in their head where they're like, sure, and then they're like, it turns out winning wasn't actually like the win on the paper is not actually what mattered to them either. So they're like, okay, well now if I lose
feel like I win?
Now if I lose now, I'm just gonna feel like I don't deserve the win, and you like gave it to me as charity. And so like that's a weird spot where it's like, I just wanted to be like, all right, this game was interesting, and then it got immediately not interesting when I made that punt. And so nothing is like, we're in a spot where it's very easy to just say, pretend I didn't make that punt, let's keep playing this game and see if I can actually turn it around in the next 4 turns. But people, I think, feel weird about that because it highlights the fact that it's like, what mattered to them was like winning the game, and then, but not in a like putting a W on the score sheet way, in a way of like, having made the right decisions at the right moments. And I'm like, great, sure, you get the score sheet thing. Now let's pretend I made the right decision in the right moment and actually played better. And now the thing that matters to you, you're actually going to lose, maybe.
That does seem like a weird position to put people in, and I wonder if you could just phrase it a little bit differently and be like, great, congratulations, you won the game. Do you mind if we just talk through some other ways this game could have gone? And then you're not saying we're replaying the game and this is still game mode. It can just be that now we're doing a little thought exercise together, and that feels like maybe a separation that wouldn't give people that strange feeling.
I haven't done this in a long time, and actually there was a very opportune moment to do it a few weeks ago where I made a huge punt in the last turn of the game, and I was like, I had the thought like I could ask them to do this, and I was like, nah, it feels weird, I'm not going to do it. But it's a weird spot.
I think I would go so far as to say it's going to be pretty uncomfortable in most cases unless you really know somebody, because you're on some level, you're breaking the social contract inherent to the game. Just like Anthony was talking about with mulligans, of like, yeah, I'm really sorry, but just like those rules exist for a reason. Ending a game and then going back into this game can be a really jarring experience. If you have two people who are like, no, both of us really want to see what was happening, or like that game is going really, really well. We both agree the game is over, but I want to see what happens. But it is a very unusual and potentially awkward social situation.
For sure.
But there's a broader lesson that I would pull from that of like, when you make a mistake, what is your reaction to it? For me, the phrase that I use from game design so often is that mistakes are the best teachers. When a playtest goes wrong, when I make a mistake, I have such a clear demonstrated thing to say like, aha, this is an opportunity to improve. This is the kind of mistake that I make. And like to list a couple of them, I think too quickly and I focus too much on overly optimizing plays and I forget to check back in. Or I know what a card does, and I forget the bit of trinket text that's relevant in a specific situation. Or I made a huge punt on Friday night in the finals of regular Cube Draft, where I just like forgot that Ivy is symmetrical with everybody else. And
speaking of trinket text, that sometimes really matters.
But I didn't get angry. I was just like, oh, well, I've lost this game, but this is a good reminder of like, especially when I haven't played with the card a ton, even if I feel like I know the card.
This is a good reminder that Ivy's bullshitting This sucks. This game blows.
I actually was inspired by that experience,
No, I
though, where
know.
I'm like,
I'm
no,
just making a
like,
joke.
I mean, I know you are, but I'm going to be earnest and excited anyway because I am. Of like, oh, there's this unusual card that didn't really have an opportunity to shine within its limited format, is not at a power level that fits into a lot of cubes, and is in a weird color combination for what it does. But like, dang it, I'm excited about it now. I don't love the symmetry of the effect in a lot of the kinds of cubes I design it with, but there's a lot of cool affordances with that cube. And so I tried to take a moment that I was just like, oh, I just like punched myself in the face. I screwed up. I threw this game away. And now instead of having an interesting back and forth, I'm going to get destroyed. And nevertheless, I like did my best to play as well as I could in that situation. Weirdly enough, the fact that I made that mistake worked to my advantage in a very bizarre way. Still got crushed by Julian. Julian's a great player, and it was a pleasure to play against Julian. But like for people who want to get better, that's one of the lessons that I would share with them of like, look at your mistakes as opportunities to learn, not opportunities to berate yourself. Look at your successes as opportunities to learn, not opportunities to pat yourself on the back. I feel like the best experiences where I feel good of like, I'm proud of what I did are those come from behind wins where I mulligan into oblivion or my opponent just like hits card after card that they need. And I find a way to navigate the sequence. The story that you were telling probably weeks ago in the podcast, but very recently temporally in the studio, of like, you don't even know how you beat Andy in this 100 Ornithopters game where Andy just went Aura Shards, Ornithopter, 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 pick everything back up with paradoxical outcome, and you nevertheless managed to grind through that. Like, those I feel like are the kinds of games that, especially once you've been playing for a while, are the ones that you live for. And the vast majority of games, you just sort of get to look at as opportunities to practice not being on tilt, learning from your mistakes, learning from your successes, which are often much, much harder to learn from mistakes because you just want to feel good about winning, or identify who you are and where you're coming from and just accept, you know what? Like, that win was kind of fun and I don't need to ruminate on it and focus on how I can get better because actually this is as good as I want to be.
I just want to keep talking about the null hypothesis, so I wonder if it's also easier to learn from your mistakes because you concretely know what didn't work. Like, I did not win this game for sure. Whereas if you win, it's like, well, which of these decisions contributed to my victory? Like, could have been all of them, could have been any of them, and there could have been many other successful decisions you could have made. So the mistakes are just like much more concrete lessons.
And also the opportunity to look at a choice that you made and evaluate, like, was this a mistake or was this something that I can justify? In general, if you can justify every decision that you make in a game, you have opportunities to improve, but like, you've never thoughtlessly made a choice. I don't know. I've played a lot of games where I'm like, we have this big back and forth, and my opponent is like, wow, I can't believe I got there. And the main thing I'm thinking about is like, on turn 2, like, 25 minutes ago in this really long game, I made this choice and it did not work out for me. And if I'd made that choice differently, I probably would have won that game. But was it reasonable with what I knew at the time for me to make that choice? And that level of evaluation is still fun for me. And also is something I'm generally never going to inflict on my opponents because it'll sound like I'm really salty. When in fact the opposite is true, is like, aha, something to learn.
Yeah.
Just to go back a little bit to the like take-backs thing, because I have one more question for you.
Is it more of an anecdote with a question at the end?
No, dick. Also, it's a podcast. It's for telling anecdotes. I think something I've become really conscious of as I've gotten older and played more Magic is I used to have this idea that Magic was like, being good at Magic was, all right, here's all the options before you. All the options are objectively derivable. You can just look at all the options, and being good at Magic is choosing the right option. It's like, all right, here's all the options available to me. I'll just pick the right one. And I felt like the seeing all the options part was like just table stakes. Like, everybody must see all the options. These cards combine in certain ways. You must know all the options. That's just like part of playing the game, is you have to be able to know how all these cards could possibly interact. And as I've played more and more Magic, I've started to more and more feel like, actually, seeing the options is a big part of being good at Magic. It's a skill you develop. It is not a thing you just have naturally. And I have yelled at a member of our Playgroup, Max. I mean, yelled somewhat somewhat playfully, but also very seriously, because I've been playing a game with somebody, and Max has walked up to the board state and gone, oh, you can just do this, you should do this, and tell my opponent what to do. And it's like, that was on the table, and you could argue that I'm being a spike by not telling them that's an option, but I think seeing that option and being able to evaluate a board, which is the thing Max is really, really good at. It's like one of the ways that Max is a very skilled player. He's so good at just seeing all these weird options. That's one of his great skills. Seeing those options, I think, is part of the skill of Magic, and I wouldn't want an opponent helping me see an option I missed because I just didn't consider these cards combining in this way, or I had ruled out a whole branch of options for some heuristic, some shorthand, and it turns out that actually one of those little branches of that option actually is correct in this spot. How does that relate to your idea of like takebacks? Do you really disagree with that premise that seeing the options and like knowing what's available to you is a big part of the skill of being good at Magic, or do you feel like it's more just making a decision from the available options?
I feel like being able to see the matrix is one of the joys of the game and improving at the game. So I'm absolutely there with you. And being great at Magic is not about being able to necessarily perceive every single action that's possible. Magic is a really, really, really hard game. Computers have solved simple things like tic-tac-toe. Computers are better than human players at chess. They are better than human players at Go, which took even longer to solve than chess, which thankfully hasn't. I think it has increased interest in those because of what we can learn from computers. Computers haven't solved Magic. That game is orders of magnitude harder to solve, and to believe that we as people are going to be able to see every single choice that presents itself to us in every single game, especially when a lot of those choices are nearly invisible. How do I sequence my lands? Which of these nearly interchangeable 2-drops do I play? Which of these nearly interchangeable removal spells do I play? Like, you can get better at that forever. And I agree with you. That's part of getting better at Magic. For the specific situation that you posited, the annoying answer I have is, well, it depends. So many things depend of like, what's the social relationship there? But in general, I want to find out whether I can present that information to my opponent without seeming patronizing. In general, I'm not going to walk over to a table and do that unless I know both people there and I know that they're up for it, because you're so likely to come across as like being bossy or patronizing. In general, if there's an action that I can take that I think is more likely than not to lead to a worse experience for the people around me, I try not to take it. Even if I'm getting on tilt, which doesn't happen that often, because all I'm going to do is make the room a less pleasant place to be in.
I guess maybe another way to put this is like, I also will police triggers for my opponent or negative triggers for me. Like, I'm never going to try and like win a game because somebody forgot a trigger that benefits them and I just said, ooh, we'll let it go. Like, I'm always just going to like tell them, right? And I think for some people, pointing out an obvious option that is on board is akin to, you know, telling them about a trigger. Like, oh, you can just do this, actually. You can, you know, sacrifice this thing and with that on the stack, do this other thing. Like, in telling them about an option they have, I think for some people, it feels exactly the same as like, well, this creature died, you gain a life from this, you know, card you have in play. And to me, I think it's actually very different. And what I will do, my normal MO is like, at the end of a game, after the whole game is over, I'll say, can I tell you about something I saw in your play? Or do you want any feedback on like some sequencing? I'll ask my opponent if they're open to like hearing my thing that I observed. And then if they say yes, which they usually do, I'm like, oh, actually, when you did this, you know, I was worried you might do this because that would have been really bad for me. And I'll like tell them sort of the sequence. And usually it's like, oh yeah, I didn't know that was a thing. But I think that's the thing I want people to be aware of, is that like those things are different. And for me, I will never tell somebody about a sequence that I see that they don't see, but I will always tell them about a mistrigger or a thing that is
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how this is just another case where you want to be helpful, but it can also come off as patronizing. And I've been trying to balance that better in the way that I deal with that. And if somebody misses a trigger, I try to wait as long as possible to remind them before it impacts another decision of theirs, because often people do say like, oh, I do this like this and I draw a card and then, oh wait, I get a counter over here because of that. And
yeah,
it
definitely
just
I always
takes
wait.
people a second. So I don't want to be aggressively just like, you got to do this, you got to do this. And finding that balance and reading your opponent and how much help they are interested in is difficult.
And here we're at danger of aggressively agreeing with each other. If all of us are trying to find ways to navigate these social situations in ways that are going to be net positive to us and the people that are around us. The situation that you described, Andy, yeah, there's a real difference between maintaining the game state, which is incumbent on all players to do and is a collaborative responsibility, and playing for the other person, where you're really in danger of just eliminating somebody from the game and playing and puppeting them, which most people aren't going to enjoy. And I feel like in general, if I've had that experience, if I've offered after the game of like, actually, would you like to know some feedback, or can I look at your deck? More often than not, people are going to say yes. And I feel like more often than not, when they say yes, they seem to appreciate the experience. I'm not going to get it right 100% of the time. I'm not going to get anything right 100% of the time, but this focus on self-improvement and being community-minded and recognizing that there are ways that there's going to be some degree of tension, but not that much tension. Navigating all of that is core to making yourself a happier person and making the world in which you exist, even if it's as small as a small cube group, a better place to live.
I got one hypothetical situation to run by you, because I agree that it's a fuzzy gray area. This is actually a game I was observing with two players playing, but let's pretend that I was the opponent. Somebody casts Wargate and is clearly trying to get their 4th mana with Wargate, and they end up, this is actually in the 100 Order of Hypercube, they end up fetching, I think, Paradise Mantle or something, because they don't realize Wargate can get a land. If you can tell they are clearly trying to get their 4th mana, do you, given the average player, remind your opponent, like, hey, by the way, that can get lands, or not?
Or do you, secret option, do you ask them, can that get lands? And have them
reread
the
the next level. That is genius. That's absolutely what you should do. Holy moly.
So this is our new segment, Genius or Kindness.
That's genius.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if oftentimes what I'm going to do in that situation is I'm not going to say anything because I'm not part of that game. I haven't entered into that social construct, and unless I know those people...
I'm saying theoretically if you're playing the person that's casting
But if
the
I'm
board game.
playing... I don't know. It depends. By and large, I'd be like, yeah, I'd probably say like, oh, cool. That can get anything, right?
You two are so quick on your feet. You're so smart.
Well, it's people will feel better when you set them up for success rather than when you tell them how to be successful. And I think this feeds back into...
And that situation with Wargame is kind of a gray area, right? Because it's not a mistrigger. It's not like they're violating the rules by getting something else. But if you can clearly tell they just haven't actually read all the text on the card, or they missed that it doesn't say non-land permanent, it's a situation where I'm sometimes on the fence about, do I help out here, or is them choosing not to read their Wargate part of the skill of being good at Magic? Part of knowing that, you reread your cards, or like make sure you know what your cards do is like part of the skill of the game.
I think this is directly related to what I was talking about a little bit earlier of how do you learn better? Do you learn by getting crushed and making the mistake and that scar helps teach you, or by doing like the thing correctly and that's the lesson? And I think for so many people, probably the best thing to do is set someone up for the opportunity to learn the lesson for themselves. Even if you're providing a really gentle guide rail, and what Anthony's put forward is a potentially great, depending on the student, example of that, of like, you gave them a step, but not the full ladder of this is something to help you make that decision. And then that's the most likely thing that's going to lead to them remembering it and growing.
That's the best one by far. Yeah. That's a great answer, because you are asking a question, not telling them anything, but the question is going to prompt them to read the card one more time, which is huge. What I actually did after watching this game, I did not intervene in the game at all. I think that would be way too far, given that I was a third party. After the game was over, I asked both players. First, I asked their opponent, I'm like, do you mind if I offer a tip?
Can I take you aside?
No, I asked their opponent, like, do you mind if I offer a tip to the person you just played? And then I asked the person, do you want a tip on one of your cards? And they both said yes. And I was like, Wargate can get lands. And they were like, oh, that would have been a lot better.
I've got a question for you guys. May or may not be a parting question. Are each of you at the level of competitiveness that you are satisfied by?
At this moment, yes. Because, what is appealing to me about the game is self-improvement, and, I can just demonstrate it. I did great at CubeCon, and then I went and got dinner. Success.
Yeah, that's pretty much Anthony's ideal level of competitiveness. I think my honest answer is not really. I still make mistakes that I wish I didn't make because they seem so obvious, and there's some degree to which I'm like, I play this game so much, I think about this game so much, I feel like I should not be making these kinds of mistakes anymore. But to the point of this entire conversation, I have not made the changes in my texture of play to make those mistakes less likely, because I'm primarily concerned when I play, which is pretty much only Tuesdays. Some weekends we'll get a cube draft together, but it's always in the same context of a casual cube draft. And my goal is always like, first and foremost, is everybody here having a good time? Is anybody uncomfortable? Is this like space welcoming, and like are the vibes good? I'm primarily, if it's someone I don't know, I want to like come off as very welcoming. Like I'm thinking about all these things that are not the game, and I'm not willing to compromise those things. So no, I wish I was a little better. I'll be honest.
Well, may I give you a piece of feedback or information?
Yeah, please do.
I will allow you to give my opponent some feedback and information.
Your opponent in
You
podcasting.
cut right past. Yep, I was going to make that joke. Over the course of this conversation, you actually talked about one area in which you've identified an opportunity to improve that would likely have no negative consequences for your opponent whatsoever.
Reading the cards?
I would say give yourself permission to spend 2 to 3 minutes extra per match. Just like spend 2 to 5 seconds reading your hand, reading your cards.
Yeah.
It is not going to meaningfully slow down the game.
It definitely is not. I already played too fast, so my match is usually over before anyone else's, so it's not a problem there.
And that is like, I've run into that issue myself where I'm like, I'm really proud of how fast I play. And I'm playing so fast that I cannot pivot. Like
I'm not proud of it. I just like I'm impatient. Like it's truly a patience thing. Like I just think too fast and like move too quickly, and it's really hard for me to consciously slow down.
And I think that's your challenge. And potentially a beautiful thing about that is that's something you can do anywhere with anyone. In any game of Magic, you have the ability to just slow down. And it doesn't need to be going into the tank every single turn. It's just untap, upkeep, draw, take a breath, and then you go.
Yeah, I should definitely do it. I've known this. I mean, I appreciate the tip, but also it is a tip I have given myself and been given many times, and it's hard. It's hard for me to do.
Yeah, but that's the hard thing with advice. It's a lot easier to give it out than it is to take it and internalize it. And it's helpful to hear it in many different ways from different kinds of people. And then at some point, you're either going to find that it's been said in the right number of ways and it clicks with you, or it's been said the right number of times and you're finally ready to receive it, or just time goes on and you're approaching things a little bit differently with somewhat different goals. And you're ready to say, like, you know what, I am ready to do that. I wouldn't be surprised if this will make you a little bit happier and have a little bit more fun by forcing you to be just a little bit more patient.
I want to end actually on a sequencing question for you. I think I can remember all the details of this game state to make this decision at least something you can weigh in on. I'm playing blue-red tempo, like a classic Delver style, low to the ground
You?
deck. I know.
A blue-red
I'm
Delver
splashing
deck?
green. It's a very cool green splash in my deck. I'm in the finals.
What do you got? I wanted the green card.
I was playing Red and 6, Questing Druid, and Sylvan Library, and
Those are all really good
It was
two
beautiful.
drops.
It was very beautiful. The board state is as follows. My opponent has a Baleful Strix, 4 or 5 cards in hand. It's still like the early mid-game. I have a Monastery Swiftspear, a Electrostatic Infantry with 1+1/+1 counter on it, 3 lands. After I draw for turn, my hand is Lightning Bolt, Slick Sequence, which I'm sure you know the rules text of.
Blue and a red, deal 2 damage, and if you cast another spell this turn, draw a card.
Yep. Young Pyromancer, Murktide Regent, Dig Through Time. My opponent is at like mid-life. They're at like, let's call 15 life.
Okay.
Yeah, 15 life. What do you do in this spot? First impression.
So they've got 3 mana up. They've
Yeah,
got
speaking to the microphone,
Oh, sorry. They've got 3 mana up. They've got a Baleful Strix.
No, they're tapped down. There's no
they're
mana
tapped
up. The question is just, I'm saying we're both on 3 lands. Like, it's still the developing part of the game.
Do you know much about their deck?
They are playing a like more controlling deck with a decent bit of removal and a couple rafts.
All right. You've got you've got Monastery Swiftspear, a 2/3 Electrostatic Infantry, Slick Sequence in hand, Lightning Bolt in hand, Murktide Regent, Dig Through Time. Am I forgetting a 5th card?
No, those are the 5 cards. You said all 5.
I think I said Lightning Bolt.
Young
Slick-
Pyromancer.
Young Pyromancer.
And I should say I have I think 4 cards in my graveyard.
So, this is a really interesting situation.
No, I had 5 cards in my graveyard.
Well, your hand is presenting you 3 very different options to go into. And yeah, in this situation, I feel like you need to make a choice. One option, we'll talk through our options that we have available. We're going to go through Dig Through Time and Murktide Regent a little bit later. because they are both about playing for the long game. The thing that you can do to go for the early game as quickly as possible is you can go bolt their face, slick sequence them. That'll attack them for 7. I think the Monastery Swift Spear will be a 3/4.
By slick sequence them, you mean the Baleful Strix.
Sorry, the slick sequence the Baleful Strix, and then hit them with Lightning Bolt.
I will tell you, this is what I did.
And that's a way to maximize the amount of damage that you get into, and it gives you the opportunity to rebuild, but you are also throwing away your Lightning Bolt by only using it as a Rift Bolt. So let's see, what is that? 4 damage plus 3 damage plus 3. So you're doing 10, you're putting them to 5. The challenge with that line is...
And I do remember the detail was I was putting them to lethal on board without having to have another spell, just from my Swift Spear and Electrostatic Infantry, if they didn't play a blocker or a removal spell, which obviously they're probably going to do one of those two things. But I remember it was, you're at lethal on board, you need an answer now.
Yep, and especially because Electrostatic Infantry, I think, innately has Trample.
It sure does.
So you're already presenting a lot of damage. The challenge is... the following turn, you don't have a great follow-up. Probably your most likely follow-up is if they have a Wrath, then you probably dig through time. You might Murktide Regent, but then you lose to a spot removal spell. Although I'm guessing this is Bun Magic and there aren't a ton of ways to deal with a Murktide Regent.
There are many fewer than there are to deal with a Monastery Swift Spear or an Electrostatic Infantry.
Yep. So a Wrath is annoying, and then you start playing for the long game, and then they might outcard you, but Dig Through Time is pretty powerful. They play a blocker, you're probably in decent shape. What would I do in that situation? I don't dislike your line. An alternative line that is a little bit less aggressive is you go Young Pyromancer, Lightning Bolt, their Baleful Strix. That exposes you even more to a Wrath.
Yep.
But it gives you a wider board presence. It does set you up for the awkward situation that Slick Sequence isn't immediately on, except if you draw a land, you're going to have 5 cards in graveyard, you draw a land, you can go... Oh, no, it won't work. Yeah, you would have to go Dig Through Time.
It's a really interesting spot.
Yeah.
And I ended up talking through this because Julian was watching over my shoulder. Julian, a much better Magic player than I. And I took the line I took. Afterwards, Julian was like, I would have done something different. And the thing he said, I was like, that literally wasn't even on my radar. Like, I knew it was literally an option, but I had ruled it out so early on. And I think he was right, ultimately.
I wouldn't be surprised if the right situation there is just attack.
Interesting. Another option not on my radar.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. This is a weird option, but it's worth at least quickly considering in the moment because
always be asking, should you attack?
I mean, it's worth considering all the options. It's the whole
attacking,
point.
Why?
Because at that point, you have not invested heavily into either of your creature resources. You've got a lot of powerful things to do with your mana. You have a Young Pyromancer that isn't going to do anything right now, but may well present a whole lot of damage later on. You have 5 points of burn, which is already a third of your opponent's life total, and there's a decent chance you're going to get more off of Dig Through Time. Filling up your graveyard means you have the ability to deploy Murktide Regent, which is just a massive threat, and now you have the ability to clear through quite a lot of blockers for it. I don't know the rest of the deck, so it's hard for me
I
to
will
be
say I didn't have much more burn. I think I had a Lava Dart in the deck. In terms of burn that went face, I didn't have a whole lot more than the Bolt and the Slick Sequence.
But Lava Dart also grows Murktide Regent, so it by itself is 3 damage.
Yeah.
I don't hate just attacking there, especially because, I don't know, your hand can play a longer game. It can develop into a variety of options. And by going Lightning Bolt, Slick Sequence, you are saying, I need the game to end in the next 2 turns, or I'm probably going to lose the long game. And if your analysis is, I really just don't think I can outgrind this deck. This is a very powerful controlling deck. They've just 2-for-1'd me with Baleful Strix. I just have to go for that out. Then yeah, your line makes sense. I wouldn't be surprised if I attack there and deploy, let's see. I've got 3 mana, so I'm going to have 5 cards in graveyard. I have to delve almost everything away to play Murktide Regent. Then I can trade off resources and go for Dig Through Time. And then after that, I can have a Young Pyromancer with a whole bunch of burn. I don't mind that line.
So the line that Julian suggested, and again, he had more information than you did. He had seen more of each of his decks, which I had ruled out, was just main phase 1, Dig Through Time. 2, find land for sure, because I had no land to play this turn. Mm-hmm. And then be able to play Young Pyromancer and untap and basically have all these options available. I instead took the Lightning Bolt Slick Sequence line, drew land for turn. It was a tap land. I played it. And I did end up winning this game. That what ended up happening is that they ended up wiping the board, I think, the next turn, and I basically had the Murktide region to follow up with, and I didn't have an answer for it. So that's how I ended up getting there. Young Pyromancer didn't come into play in the game, basically. But ultimately, I do think that I had ruled out Dig Through Time for the sole purpose of, like, I had the 2 Delve spells in hand, and I'm like, well, obviously I play the dragon first, because then the Dig Through Time grows the dragon. So I'm going to play the Murktide region before I play Dig Through Time no matter what. Then I looked at that turn, and I was like, I don't want to play Murktide region here because I feel like I'm overcommitting to the board. So instead, I'm just going to, like, you know, turn my Slick Sequence on by casting this Lightning Bolt, which I'm also cashing in for, like, 5 additional damage, right? Because I get 2 effective prowess triggers. Like, I'm 5ing you with the Lightning Bolt, and I get to draw a card with the Slick Sequence, which makes me kind of a parody on the Baleful Strix trade, which ended up working out. But ultimately, I think Julian was probably right that I should have just main phase 1 Dig Through Time, definitely hit land drop, definitely play on Young Pyromancer, and then untap with all the answers I could want to all their threats.
Although, given the situation you described, that might have been a losing play because you cashed in the Dig Through Time for a land that ultimately wasn't relevant because you could have drawn a land anyway, either from the Slick Sequence or for turn. You would have overcommitted to the board, and then they just Wrath, and now you're down 3 creatures instead of 2.
Yeah, I don't know. It was a funny spot.
And
this is what I love about Magic, though. And I didn't even, whether it was right or wrong, I did not even think about the Dig Through Time main 1 line. It didn't even occur to me. Nor did I honestly think about just attack line. These lines, I was just like, well, those are clearly not options. I'm either going to Young Pyromancer, Bolt the Baleful Strix, or I'm going to bolt you, Slick Sequence the Baleful Strix, and attack. Like, those are my 2 lines that I actually weighed between.
And this is a great reminder of several things at once. One, there are way more options presented to us over the course of any game, but certainly a game of Magic, than often we're considering.
Yeah.
Option 2, we have heuristics. They, by and large, lead to us playing better games because we don't have to think through every single part of every single game. But these heuristics can lead us astray. And sometimes it's useful for us to take that 5 to 10 seconds and be like, what's a line that I'm not even considering?
That's what I don't do that I need to do. Is like, why have I ruled out these lines? And did I rule them out for actually good reasons or just for, like, rule of thumb reasons that actually don't come into play here?
And option 3, there's that thing of, like, maybe 80% of the time, Julian's line is just, like, going to lead to you winning every single time. But this is the 20% of cases where they actually have Wrath plus removal spell. And if you go for that line of you Young Pyromancer Dig Through Time, you've speed off the value from the Dig Through Time, you've gotten a land off of Dig Through Time instead of 2 spells, and you overextend into the Wrath. And in this particular game, you're in that 20% where actually it leads you astray. On the one hand, you still get to pat yourself on the back of, like, I made the best choice possible given the general kind of circumstances I'm dealing with. Or, hey, I get to pat myself on the back. I did something weird and unusual, and in this particular case, it was based on a read or good vibes, and I won. And
I'm also just fundamentally aggressive as a player, which I think is a weak point. Just that you shouldn't, like, have a tendency. You should do whatever's right in the moment. And I often will be like, well, I get to bolt them and make my bolt deal 5 and also put lethal on board and get rid of this Baleful Strix and still draw a card in the exchange. Like, that's a line that I'm very inclined to take rather than a more conservative line. So I have to, like, also keep that in mind, that I have a predilection.
I have a predilection too, though. I think part of becoming a, like, insanely great player is being good at everything, but everybody has preferences. And I've already articulated, like, what do I love about Control? I love the play experience of it. And I've probably played these sort of grindy decks more than I played on average most other styles of decks. I have a lot of heuristics built up there that I don't have nearly as well developed for other types of deck. So I play them better, so I'm predisposed to play them better. And yeah, do I draft really aggressive or mid-rangey decks or non-blue decks? I mean, if I have to. But, like, yes, I'm competent enough to pilot all of those kinds of decks, but I still have my favorites. And frankly, when this leads to me rolling up to play Cube with friends, often they know that, and then people open my lane up because they don't want to fight with me about it anyway, which has advantages and disadvantages of, one, it means I sort of keep doing the same thing, and I'm doing the thing that I'm already good at rather than building existing skills. And on the other hand, I don't know, this is about as good as I want to be, and I want to have fun playing cards that I love with my friends.
Yeah. Magic is so great.
But yeah, thank you for the, the like 10-minute diversion of like, no, here's this cool situation.
I mean, honestly, pat myself on the back. I love that stuff comes up with the Bud Magic Cube all the time. Those turns are why I built that cube, and that's what I'm trying to create, those kinds of turns. And I thought it was a really interesting one. We gotta go. We gotta go to lunch soon. So we gotta walk the dog first. So that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. If we got any card text wrong, that was intentional to bait engagement. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic Cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards and Speaking to Microphones About It. Thank you, Anthony and Zach, for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you. I got a parting question for you guys. I'm working on a project right now. It's inspired by Dan Schneider's Old Border Battle Box called the Snapcaster Battle Box. Reason is, Snapcaster Mage is just my favorite card to play with in Cube. I have a lot of cards that I love.
It's up there for me too. It's really up there.
But I just adore it. I'm curious, are there other cards in your books that give you sort of similar amounts of joy? You're going to over-prioritize it if you see it in a pack. You're going to want to put it into every environment in which it makes sense, even ones that it doesn't. What cards just bring you the most joy to play?
Not to be a copier, but Snapcaster Mage is really up there for me. I adore that card. It's so clean. It can play so many different roles. I'm also a huge Dark Confidant fan. I put that card in so many cubes, and I love everything about it. I love that it's a risk. I love that it costs your life to get more resources. I think it's a perfect exchange. That one's really far up there for me.
All right, well, this is a pretty easy question for me, and one that will truly bore the listeners, but I'm just such a huge fan of White Mane Lion and Core Skyfisher. Really, this is one of the earliest level up moments for me in Magic, when I opened this White Mane Lion in a draft, and I'm like, well, this seems kind of bad. It's I guess you get a 2/2, but you have to do this thing, and then discovering ways to actually turn that downside into an upside was a really satisfying moment in Magic. And I guess we got to throw Clarion Spirit in there just because, I'm from Baltimore and apparently we're sickos and we just love putting Clarion Spirit in all our cubes.
I'd like to note that every single card all of us have mentioned as our favorites
Cost 2 mana as a creature?
are 2-mana creatures.
Okay, fine. Squirrel Nest. I love Squirrel Nest.
Yuck.
Very different card from the other ones you described.
Well, not so much, because you can play you can tap the Squirrel Nest, make a squirrel, cast the Core Skyfisher to pick up the Squirrel Nest, and then play it again and make another squirrel when you have 9 mana in play.
Heck? That's a hell sequence. I'll give a little shout out to Bitter Blossom too for similar reasons to Dark Confidant. I just adore that card too. But yeah, that's it.